November 4th, 2023, Cedar Creek, Michigan. The air, sharp with the metallic tang of approaching winter, was thick with the growl of heavy machinery. Davy Sullivan, seated in the vibrating cab of his John Deere excavator, felt the rhythm of his work break. He was digging the foundation for the new Cedar Creek Community Center Annex, a project that had been debated by the town council for 5 years. The ground here, near the edge of the old public library parking lot, was supposed to be soft fill and clay. But the bucket had snagged on something. It wasn't the metallic screech of hitting rock or the dull thud of a concrete pipe. It was a yielding resistance, a tear. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence of the site felt heavy, broken only by the distant beep, beep, beep of a reversing cement truck. Davy slid from the cab, his steel-toed boots sinking into the cold grey mud. He peered into the trench, his breath fogging in the air. A corner of dark, rotted material protruded from the newly turned earth. It looked like an old tarp, or perhaps a heavy-duty garbage bag, brittle with age. He grabbed a shovel, carefully scraping the mud away. The material tore easily, revealing a sodden, compressed bundle. The smell hit him then, a deep, musty odor of ancient decay that clung to the back of his throat. It wasn't the clean scent of earth. It was the smell of things long hidden. He used the shovel's edge to peel back another layer. He saw bone. It was pale, unmistakable, a thin, delicate radius, and nearby, a tangle of what looked like dark, matted fabric. He stumbled back, reaching for the radio on his belt, his heart hammering against his ribs. Within an hour, the construction site was a different entity, swarming with police cruisers, their flashing blue and red lights painting the grey landscape. Detective Maria Karras of the Cedar Creek PD stood at the edge of the trench, her face grim. The county forensics team was already working under bright halogen lamps, gently brushing mud from the discovery. They had found more than just bones. They found the remnants of a denim jacket, the kind popular decades ago, and tangled within the fabric, a small, tarnished silver chain. Attached to the chain was a heart-shaped locket. As one of the techs carefully bagged the locket, an older officer, Sergeant Miles, who had been with the force for 40 years, moved closer to Karras. He looked into the pit, then at the locket, and his face seemed to age. "My God, Maria," he whispered, the words catching in the cold air. "I never thought. I think it's her. I think you're looking at Sarah Jenkins." The name hung in the air, a piece of local lore, a ghost story used to frighten teenagers, a permanent wound in the town's psyche, a disappearance from 1988, a case that had defined the town's loss of innocence. The discovery under the foundation didn't just break the ground, it broke 35 years of agonizing, unresolved silence. In the summer of 1988, Sarah Jenkins was 19 and felt for the first time that her life was entirely her own. She had just completed her freshman year at Michigan State University, studying literature, and was back home in Cedar Creek, saving money for the fall semester. She worked the evening shift at the Maple Leaf Diner, a local institution with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that still played more Creedence Clearwater Revival than Prince. Sarah was vibrant, with a laugh that made the diner's regulars smile, and a kindness that was disarming. She argued with her 12-year-old sister, Emily, over the shared bathroom. She listened to cassettes of The Cure and U2 on her Walkman, and she was saving up for a used Honda Civic. On the evening of August 12, 1988, the air was humid and thick, typical for a Michigan August. Sarah had spent the afternoon at the community pool with her friends, her skin smelling of chlorine and coconut sunscreen. At home, she rushed to get ready for her 4:00 p.m. shift. Her mother, Helen Jenkins, was in the kitchen, packing leftovers. "You'll be late, Sarah," Helen called out. I know," Sarah yelled back, hopping on one foot as she pulled on her white ked sneakers. She ran into the kitchen, grabbing her denim jacket from the back of a chair. It was her favorite, adorned with pins from bands and causes. "Don't forget your shift ends at 10, Helen said, her voice a familiar mix of love and worry. "Brenda is closing, so you make sure you walk out with her." "Mum, I'm fine. I walk that route every day. It's 6 blocks, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "And I might go with Brenda and Mark to the quarry for a bit after." Helen frowned. "The quarry? Sarah, that's not safe. We're just going to look at the stars, Mum. I'll be home by midnight, I promise." She kissed her mother on the cheek, the gesture quick, automatic. Her younger sister Emily was watching cartoons in the living room. "Bye, Em, don't mess with my tapes." "You're not the boss of me," Emily shouted back, never taking her eyes off the television. Sarah laughed and grabbed her keys. She paused at the doorway, turning back to her mother. "Oh, Grandma called. She said to tell you the locket clasp is fixed and she'll give it to me tomorrow." Helen smiled. The locket was an heirloom passed down, and Sarah had been upset when the chain broke. "That's good, dear. Now go. You're late." Sarah gave a final wave and sprinted out the door, her denim jacket flapping. Helen watched her go, a familiar pang of love and anxiety in her chest. She watched until Sarah's retreating form was just a speck, disappearing around the corner onto Elm Street. It was the last time Helen Jenkins would ever see her daughter. The shift at the Maple Leaf Diner was standard for a Friday. The dinner rush came at 6, a wave of families and local workers, and tapered off by 8. Sarah and Brenda, her co-worker and friend, managed the floor, refilling coffee cups, trading jokes, and complaining about the ineffective ceiling fans. The heat of the kitchen grills made the humid air feel like soup. Sarah, usually energetic, seemed slightly distracted. "You okay, hun?" Brenda asked, wiping down the chrome countertop. Sarah leaned against the pass-through window, fanning herself with a menu. "Yeah, fine, just thinking." "About that guy from MSU?" Brenda probed, stacking clean glasses. Sarah blushed. "No, well, maybe. It's just, I don't know. I feel like I'm supposed to be doing something bigger than this. You know. Bigger than serving meatloaf to Mr. Henderson for the 3rd time this week." Brenda deadpanned. Sarah laughed. "Exactly. I just can't wait to get back to campus. This town feels so small sometimes." At 9:45 p.m., the last customers paid their check. Sarah cashed out her tips, splitting them with Brenda and the kitchen staff. She counted the bills, folded them, and slipped them into the pocket of her denim jacket. "So, you still up for the quarry?" Mark, Brenda's boyfriend, asked as he came in to pick Brenda up, his baseball cap turned backward. "Nah, I think I'm just going to head home," Sarah said, surprising them. "I'm more tired than I thought. That heat just wiped me out." "You sure?" Brenda asked. "We can give you a ride home anyway." "No, it's fine," Sarah insisted, smiling. "It's a nice night. The walk will feel good. I'll see you tomorrow." She untied her apron, hung it on the hook by the back door, and pushed through the screen door, which slammed shut with a familiar thwack. Brenda and Mark watched her walk down the alley toward the street, her white keds bright under the buzzing yellow streetlights. The clock in the diner kitchen ticked loudly, the sound echoing in the now empty room. 9:58 p.m. At the Jenkins house, the air was still. Helen was reading in the living room, the television on low. Emily was asleep. The mantel clock chimed 10. Helen glanced at it, took a sip of her cooling tea, and turned a page. 10:30. She looked at the clock again. A small knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Sarah was usually punctual, or she would call from the diner's payphone if she was running late. Helen walked to the kitchen and dialed the diner. The phone rang 6 times before Brenda, just about to lock up, answered. "Maple Leaf. Brenda, it's Helen Jenkins. Is Sarah still there?" "Oh, hi, Mrs. Jenkins. No, she left about 35 minutes ago, right at 10. Helen gripped the receiver. She didn't leave with you and Mark?" "No, she said she was tired and just wanted to walk home. She should have been there 20 minutes ago." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over Helen. "Thank you, Brenda." She hung up the phone, her hand trembling. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock, each second stretching into an agonizing void. Helen Jenkins moved from the kitchen to the front porch, flipping the exterior light switch on and off, as if the flickering light could somehow summon her daughter. She stood on the welcome mat, peering into the darkness of Elm Street. The street was empty. The oppressive humidity of the day had finally broken, and a light, cool breeze was starting to blow, rustling the leaves of the large oak tree in their front yard. The sound was usually comforting. Now it sounded like whispers. She went back inside, her movements jerky, automatic. She called Sarah's best friend, Lisa. "Lisa, Helen Jenkins. Is Sarah with you?" Lisa, roused from sleep, sounded confused. "No, Mrs. Jenkins. I haven't seen her since this afternoon at the pool. Is she okay?" She hasn't come home from work," Helen said, her voice cracking on the last word. Panic was a physical thing, a cold liquid rising in her chest. She hung up and woke her husband. Mark, wake up, Sarah's not home." Mark Jenkins, a man who worked in logistics and understood timelines, sat up instantly, shedding sleep. "What do you mean she's not home? He squinted at the digital clock on the nightstand. 11:15 p.m. "She left the diner at 10. She should have been home at 10:10, Helen said, pulling at the threads of her bathrobe. "I called Brenda. She walked." Within minutes, Mark was dressed, his face pale. "I'll drive the route. You stay here in case she calls. Maybe she stopped somewhere." Helen nodded, numb. She watched from the living room window as the red tail lights of their Ford Taurus disappeared down the street. The panic was transforming into a frantic, buzzing energy. She called the diner again. No answer. She called Lisa again. "Can you call anyone else? Anyone she might have talked to?" While Mark drove the 6 blocks from their house to the diner and back, scanning alleys, checking the small town square, Helen paced the length of the living room. The sound of her own breathing was too loud. The house felt wrong, empty. At 11:45 p.m., Mark returned, his face etched with a new, deeper fear. "Nothing. The diner's dark. The whole street is dark. I even checked the park." "We have to call the police," Helen whispered. "They'll say we have to wait," Mark said, running his hands through his hair. "They'll say she's 19, she's an adult, she's probably just out with friends." "I don't care what they say. Something is wrong, Mark. I can feel it." At 12:03 a.m., Mark Jenkins dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, procedural, which felt like an insult. "Sir, it's only been 2 hours. It's common for kids that age to—" "She's not that kind of kid," Mark yelled, his voice breaking. "She always calls. Always." The noise woke Emily. She padded into the hall, rubbing her eyes, her small frame silhouetted in the doorway. "Mom! Dad, what's wrong? Where's Sarah?" Helen looked at her youngest daughter, and the facade of control shattered. She sank onto the sofa, and a terrible, raw sob tore from her throat. That was the moment. The confusion and worry of the past 2 hours crystallized into a single, terrifying realization. Sarah was gone. The flashing lights of the Cedar Creek police cruiser arriving at 1:30 a.m. on August 13th felt like a violation of the quiet, sleeping street. Officer Danvers, young and trying to project authority, stepped onto the porch. He took Helen and Mark Jenkins through the standard questions. What was she wearing? Denim jacket, white keds, her diner uniform. Who were her friends? Did she have a boyfriend? Was she depressed? The questions felt blunt, invasive, implying a fault in Sarah, a reason she might choose to disappear. She didn't run away, Helen insisted, her voice hoarse from crying. She was happy, she was excited about going back to school, she was saving her money. By 3:00 a.m., Officer Danvers had called his superior, Detective Frank Miller. Miller, a man who had seen too much in his 25 years on the force, arrived looking weary. He was methodical. He took the high school photo of Sarah from the mantel, the one of her in a blue prom dress, smiling, her braces recently removed. He organized a preliminary search. Flashlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the 6-block route Sarah should have walked. They scanned backyards, ditches, and the small patch of woods that separated the diner's parking lot from the adjacent residential street. They found nothing. No dropped keys, no scuff marks, no denim jacket. As dawn broke, the grey light revealed a town waking up to a nightmare. The news spread the way it does in small towns, through phone calls over backyard fences. By 7:00 a.m., neighbors and friends gathered at the Jenkins house, bringing coffee and donuts, their faces etched with disbelief. Mark Jenkins, refusing to sit still, was coordinating with Detective Miller, unrolling a map of the town on his dining room table. He was assigning grids. The high school football team was called in to search the quarry, the place Sarah had mentioned. Brenda and Mark, her boyfriend, were interviewed by Miller, their faces pale with shock and guilt. "She just said she was tired," Brenda repeated, crying. "She said she wanted to walk. Why did we let her walk?" By noon, the Maple Leaf Diner had become an impromptu command center. Volunteers signed in, grabbing stacks of freshly photocopied flyers bearing Sarah's smiling face and the word "missing" in bold black letters. The first 24 hours were a blur of adrenaline and agonizing hope. Every ringing phone call made Helen jump, her heart leaping into her throat, only to have it be another neighbor asking what they could do. Emily sat on the stairs, silent, clutching one of Sarah's cassette tapes, watching the adults move with a frantic purpose she didn't understand. As the sun began to set on the first full day, the hope that had fueled the search began to curdle into a shared, unspoken dread. The flashlights came out again, but the mood was different. It was no longer a search for a lost teenager, it was a search for clues to something terrible. The first week was a cruel lesson in the elasticity of time. Moments dragged into agonizing hours, yet the days blurred together in a fog of exhaustion and fear. The missing posters, bearing Sarah's bright, hopeful 19-year-old face, became a grim new part of the Cedar Creek landscape. They were taped to the windows of the grocery store, stapled to telephone poles, and pinned to the community board at the library. Every resident of the town now knew Sarah's height, her weight, and the clothes she was wearing when she vanished. News crews from Detroit and Toledo descended on the small town, their satellite trucks parked outside the Jenkins home. Helen and Mark, their faces gaunt and hollowed by lack of sleep, gave a desperate plea on the local evening news. "Sarah, if you can hear this, please just call," Mark said, his voice thick. "We love you. We just want you home." Helen sat beside him, unable to speak, clutching a tissue. The plea generated a flurry of tips, everyone a painful dead end. A truck driver thought he saw a girl matching Sarah's description at a rest stop 100 miles north. It wasn't her. A local woman claimed to have seen her get into a blue sedan near the diner, but her timeline was inconsistent, and she later admitted she wasn't sure of the date. The investigation, led by Detective Miller, was systematic but strained. The small police force was overwhelmed. They dragged the quarry, finding nothing but rusted tires and beer cans. They recanvassed the 6-block route, knocking on every door. Arthur Harrison, the high school guidance counselor who lived just 2 blocks from the diner, was particularly helpful. "I did see her, Detective," Harrison told Miller, standing on his manicured porch. "Right around 10, maybe 10:05, she walked right past here." Harrison was a pillar of the community, a kind, soft-spoken man who had helped countless students with their college applications, including Sarah herself. "She waved," Harrison continued, his expression one of profound sadness. "She seemed perfectly fine, just walking home. It's a tragedy, just a terrible tragedy." His statement was taken as fact, a reliable data point that narrowed the window of her disappearance to the 4 blocks between his house and her own. The football team and volunteers scoured that area shoulder to shoulder. They found nothing. For the Jenkins family, the house became a prison of grief. Helen stopped eating. Mark obsessively cleaned the garage, organizing tools, needing something, anything to control. Emily, confused and frightened by her parents' consuming sorrow, retreated into herself. She would sit in Sarah's room, smelling her sister's perfume on the pillows, waiting. The community's initial surge of support began to fracture. Whispers replaced offers of help. Did she run away? Was there trouble at home? Was it the boyfriend from college? The boyfriend was interviewed, his alibi absolute. He was in Ann Arbor. The focus turned inward. Suspicion fell on strangers, then on neighbors. The town felt brittle, mistrustful. 7 days after Sarah pushed through the diner's screen door, Detective Miller sat at his desk, staring at the case file. The leads were dry. The tips had slowed to a trickle. The search parties had stopped. The harsh reality was settling in. Sarah Jenkins was not simply lost. She had been taken. The formal investigation settled into a grim, bureaucratic rhythm at the Cedar Creek Police Department. The building, a squat brick structure from the 1960s, smelled of stale coffee and carbon paper. Sarah's disappearance, which had been a frantic town-wide emergency, was now Case File 88-142. Detective Frank Miller, a man running on caffeine and a dwindling sense of optimism, found his resources stretched thin. In 1988, forensic science was a world away from what it would become. There was no DNA database, no sophisticated analysis of trace evidence. Investigations relied on witness testimony, instinct, and polygraphs. Miller, though a decent cop, was a product of his time. He was overwhelmed. He had the diner staff, Sarah's friends, and her family polygraphed. They all passed, their results showing nothing but the acute stress of grief. The focus kept returning to the blue sedan tip, however unreliable. Miller put out a bolo, be on the lookout for the vehicle, a request so vague it was useless. He re-interviewed Arthur Harrison, the guidance counselor. "Are you certain about the time, Mr. Harrison?" Miller asked, seated in Harrison's neat, book-lined living room. "Absolutely, Detective," Harrison said, offering Miller a glass of iced tea. "My kitchen clock looks right out onto the street. It was 10:05 p.m. I was just cleaning up after dinner. She walked by right as I was at the sink." His demeanor was unwavering. He was the perfect witness, calm, articulate, and respected. His testimony cemented the timeline, focusing all police attention on the last 4 blocks of Sarah's walk. This, unknowingly, was the investigation's critical error. They were searching the wrong place. The case file grew thick with reports that led nowhere. Miller pursued a theory that she had been abducted by a transient, someone passing through on the nearby interstate. He spent weeks chasing down sightings of hitchhikers and checking records of recently paroled offenders in the state. Each lead dissolved upon inspection. The press coverage, once intense, moved on to other, fresher tragedies. The town, desperate for a return to normalcy, began to take the missing posters down. They were a reminder of a fear no one wanted to live with. Inside the Jenkins home, silence reigned. Mark and Helen communicated in whispers, the vibrant energy of their family home replaced by a suffocating stillness. Emily, entering junior high, found herself defined by the tragedy. She was the girl whose sister disappeared. She became quiet, watchful. Her childhood abruptly ended. The case file, once on Miller's active desk, was moved to a cabinet. Miller was a good man, but he was also a practical one. There were new burglaries, domestic disputes, and a DUI crash that needed his attention. He had no evidence, no suspect, and no body. Sarah Jenkins had vanished into the humid August air. By 1990, 2 years after Sarah's disappearance, the case was officially classified as cold. Detective Miller still kept her photo pinned to the corkboard above his desk, a constant, nagging reminder of his failure. But the daily demands of his job had pushed her file into the deep archives. The investigation hadn't just failed, it had evaporated. The critical error, trusting Arthur Harrison's timeline so implicitly, had sent the entire search down a blind alley. Because Harrison saw her at 10:05, Miller had focused his efforts on the street, believing she was abducted during her walk. The possibility that she had never made it that far, that the danger lay before Harrison's house, was never seriously considered. His statement, intended to be helpful, was the perfect misdirection. He had provided an alibi for Sarah, placing her alive and well after she had left the diner, effectively shielding the real location of the crime from scrutiny. The investigation stalled due to a complete lack of physical evidence. In 1988, the concept of touch DNA didn't exist. The diner, the alley, and the street were canvassed, but they were public spaces, contaminated by hundreds of people. Without a crime scene, there was nothing to test, nothing to analyze. The blue sedan lead was a ghost. Rumors and local gossip, which had burned so fiercely in the first few weeks, eventually died down, replaced by an uncomfortable collective amnesia. It was easier for Cedar Creek to function if Sarah's disappearance was treated as a tragic anomaly, a lightning strike, rather than a sign of a predator living among them. The town slowly rebuilt its sense of safety, but it was a brittle, superficial peace. For the Jenkins family, the failure of the investigation was a second trauma. Mark, consumed by anger and frustration, sued the police department for negligence, a suit that was quickly dismissed and only served to isolate the family further. The strain was too much. In 1991, Mark and Helen Jenkins divorced. Mark moved to Grand Rapids, a man hollowed out by grief. Helen stayed, a ghost in her own home, refusing to change a single thing in Sarah's bedroom. The file box labeled Jenkins S. Missing was moved to the police department's basement records room, a cramped, damp space filled with forgotten files. It sat on a metal shelf, gathering dust, a testament to a mystery the town had chosen to bury long before Sarah's body was ever found. Time moved on, as it cruelly does, indifferent to human suffering. The 1990s brought massive change. The Berlin Wall fell, the internet was born, and music shifted from cassette tapes to compact discs. In Cedar Creek, the Maple Leaf Diner, unable to compete with the new Applebee's that opened by the interstate, closed its doors in 1994. It was eventually torn down and replaced by a chain pharmacy. The old police station was renovated. Detective Frank Miller retired in 1998, moving to Florida. Haunted by the smiling face of the girl on the missing poster he could never take down. But in the Jenkins house on Elm Street, time stood still. Helen Jenkins lived a quiet, secluded life. She kept Sarah's room as a shrine. The denim jacket was gone, but her textbooks were still stacked on the desk, her posters of The Cure still taped to the wall, her white keds still by the door, waiting for a wearer who would never return. The room became a pocket of 1988, a place of suspended grief. Neighbors would see Helen tending her garden, a polite, sad woman who never spoke of her daughter. The town viewed her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. She was the living embodiment of their worst fear. The sharp, active pain of the first few years had subsided into a chronic, dull ache for the community. But for Helen, and for Mark in his separate, lonely life, the grief was a constant companion, an amputation they never learned to live without. They existed in the unbearable ambiguity of a disappearance. Sarah was neither alive nor dead. She was simply gone. This void denied them the closure of a funeral, the finality of a gravesite. They were trapped in the last moment they saw her, Helen seeing her daughter run out the door, Mark remembering her laugh at the dinner table 2 nights before. Seasons changed. Snows fell, melting into springs. The tree in the front yard, the one Sarah had passed on her way out, grew taller, its branches spreading, casting a longer shadow over the house where a family waited for an answer that never came. While the town, her parents, and the police department had resigned themselves to the void, Emily Jenkins had not. The 12-year-old girl who sat silent on the stairs, clutching a cassette tape, had grown up defined by her sister's absence. For Emily, Sarah wasn't a ghost story. She was a burning, unanswered question. The confusion of her childhood had hardened into a quiet, relentless obsession. She graduated from Cedar Creek High, the same school where Arthur Harrison had once been a beloved counselor. He had, in fact, written her own letter of recommendation for college, his signature on the bottom of a letter praising her resilience. The irony was a bitter poison she wouldn't understand for decades. Emily went to college, not at MSU like her sister, but at a small liberal arts school where she studied criminology. She returned to Cedar Creek, unable to leave the gravitational pull of the mystery. She got a job as a paralegal, the work training her to see patterns, to understand evidence, and to navigate the bureaucracy that had failed her family. At night, her apartment was a mirror of the official dusty case file. She had copies of every report, every transcribed interview. She had her own maps, her own timelines, her own suspect lists. She interviewed Sarah's old friends, people now in their 30s with children of their own, forcing them to dredge up painful, half-forgotten memories. "I just don't remember, Emily," they would say, uncomfortable. It was so long ago. But Emily never forgot. She noted every inconsistency. She built a website dedicated to the case, a simple, stark page with Sarah's photo and the few facts they knew. She ran it for years, a digital plea in the dark. Her obsession was quiet, methodical. It was not the frantic grief of her mother. It was the focused, patient anger of a hunter. She knew the original investigation was flawed. She fixated on the timeline. She walked the 6-block route herself hundreds of times at all hours, in all weather. She timed it. 10 minutes. If Sarah left at 9:58, she should have been home by 10:08. Harrison claimed he saw her at 10:05, just blocks from the diner. It was possible, but tight. It left a window of only 3 or 4 minutes for an abduction on a residential street. It felt wrong. By 2008, 20 years had passed. Emily was 32 years old, a woman whose life had been shaped by a shadow. She sat in her apartment, surrounded by boxes of paper, and stared at the map. The answer was here. She knew it. She just couldn't see it. The obsession, which had been a private burden for so long, began to transform. Emily realized that staring at the same facts would not yield a new result. The pain, the raw, isolating grief of her youth started to channel itself outward. If she couldn't find Sarah, perhaps she could help find someone. In 2009, she used her paralegal background and her intimate knowledge of the system's failings to establish the Michigan Hope Initiative, a non-profit dedicated to advocating for the families of the missing. She became a voice for people trapped in the same ambiguous hell that had consumed her family. She learned to speak to the media, not as a victim, but as an expert. She lobbied state legislators for better funding for cold case units and for the creation of a statewide DNA database for unidentified remains. This new purpose gave her a structure for her grief. It was no longer a destructive obsession. It was a mission. She organized vigils, she counseled families, she taught them how to request files and how to keep pressure on law enforcement. She met other people like her, other siblings, parents and children, all living with a question mark at the center of their lives. This community of shared loss provided a strange, profound comfort. She was no longer just Sarah's sister. She was Emily, the advocate, the woman who turned a personal void into a public service. She still kept Sarah's case file, but it was no longer the only one. Her office was now filled with the faces of other missing people, other cold cases she was trying to push into the light. She still felt the ache of Sarah's absence every day, but it no longer defined her. She had found a way to live with the mystery, rather than inside it. In 2012, at a conference for cold case advocates, she met a retired detective from Detroit. She told him Sarah's story. He listened patiently, then asked a question that would shift her focus forever. You said the witness, the counsellor, saw her walk past his house. You've been focusing on the street after that. What about at his house? Was his background ever really checked? Emily's advocacy work had put her in contact with a wide network of people who, like her, picked at the loose threads of the past. She started a podcast, Frozen in Time, dedicated to Michigan cold cases. It was through this podcast, in 2018, that she connected with a group of amateur online investigators, web sleuths who specialized in digging through public records and old newspapers. They were fascinated by Sarah's case. Emily shared her files, including the witness statements. One of the sleuths, a woman from Oregon, focused on Arthur Harrison. He had been the perfect witness, the kind, grieving counselor. But the detective's question from 2012 had always bothered Emily. Was his background ever really checked? In 1988, the answer was no. He was a community pillar. In 2019, the internet left digital footprints. The online group discovered that Harrison had moved from Cedar Creek in 2005, selling his house and retiring to Florida. They found his new address, but they also found something else. In 1979, before moving to Cedar Creek, Harrison had been a teacher at a high school near Ann Arbor. A student newspaper from that year mentioned he had abruptly resigned mid-semester for personal reasons. It was a tiny crack, but Emily seized it. She used her resources at the Hope Initiative to request any public records from that school district. It took months, but she finally received a heavily redacted file. It was a complaint, filed by the parents of a 16-year-old female student, alleging inappropriate attention and unwanted correspondence from Mr. Harrison. The complaint had been quietly buried, and Harrison was allowed to resign to avoid a scandal. He had moved to Cedar Creek a year later. Emily felt a sickening lurch. This didn't prove murder, but it proved he was a liar, capable of hiding a dark secret. He wasn't just the kindly counselor. He was a man with a history of fixating on teenage girls. She looked at her map again. The diner. His house, just 2 blocks away. The route she should have taken. What if she never made it past his house? What if the reliable witness who saw her at 10:05 p.m. was the last person to ever see her because he was the one who stopped her? A new, terrible theory began to form, a thread that connected the past to a horrifying possibility. On November 4th, 2023, Emily Jenkins was in her office, preparing for a press conference for another family's case, when her cell phone rang. The caller ID read, Cedar Creek Police Department. Her heart stopped. She hadn't spoken to them in years. Not since they had politely dismissed her inquiries about Arthur Harrison as circumstantial. She answered. The voice on the other end was female, professional, and young. Ms. Jenkins, this is Detective Maria Karras. Emily sat down. Yes? Miss Jenkins, a crew digging the foundation for the new community center annex. They found something. They found human remains. Emily closed her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. This was the call, the one she had rehearsed in her mind for 35 years. Where? She whispered. The site is on Maple Avenue, just behind the old library parking lot. Emily's mind raced. She knew that land. She knew exactly whose property it had once backed up against. That was Arthur Harrison's backyard, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. There was a pause on the line. Yes, Ms. Jenkins, Detective Karras said, her voice softening. We know. The remains were found with some clothing, a denim jacket, and they found a small heart-shaped locket. Emily let out a sound, a sharp intake of breath that was half sob, half gasp. The locket, the one her grandmother had, the one that was fixed, the one Sarah was supposed to pick up the next day. Her mother, Helen, in her grief, must have forgotten that detail, but Emily remembered. Sarah must have gotten it early. She must have been wearing it that night. The world tilted. The abstract mystery, the ghost she had been chasing, suddenly became terrifyingly real. It was a body. It was bones in the mud. It was her sister, buried for 35 years in the backyard of the man who claimed he watched her walk by. The operator, Davy Sullivan, climbing down from his cab. The mud, the blue tarp, the smell. All of it was the unwrapping of a secret kept for 3.5 decades. The vague where of Emily's entire life had just been answered. Sarah had never made it home. She had barely made it 2 blocks. The discovery sent a shockwave through the Cedar Creek Police Department. The cold case, Jenkins S.E., was instantly reopened as a homicide. The county medical examiner's office took possession of the remains. The process was slow, respectful. Forensic anthropologists confirmed the bones belonged to a Caucasian female, late teens, with a height consistent with Sarah's. The jawbone was intact, and a quick check of Sarah's dental records provided a positive identification within 24 hours. It was, without any doubt, Sarah Jenkins. Detective Maria Karras, the new lead investigator, felt the weight of the case settle on her. She had grown up in Cedar Creek. Sarah Jenkins was a local legend, a cautionary tale. Karras had not known Sarah, but she had known Emily, the tireless advocate. The first and hardest call Karras made was to Helen Jenkins. Helen, now in her late 70s, was frail. Emily was with her when the call came. Karras explained the discovery, the dental match, the locket. Helen was silent for a long time, and then she wept, a terrible dry weeping for a grief that was 35 years old, but suddenly as fresh and raw as it was in 1988. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a horrific certainty. The next call was to Emily, this time officially. "We are treating this as a homicide," Karras said, her voice firm, "and the location of the discovery is our primary lead. Your research on Arthur Harrison is no longer circumstantial, Ms. Jenkins. It's the entire foundation of this case. The file Emily had spent decades building was hand-delivered to Karras. The old, flawed 1988 investigation was discarded. This was a new investigation, starting from a single horrifying point. Sarah's body was in Harrison's backyard. The press conference was pandemonium. The news that Sarah Jenkins had been found, and where, stunned Cedar Creek. People who had been students in 1988, who had known Mr. Harrison, who had been counseled by him, felt a wave of collective sickness. He had been there, at the vigils. He had donated to the search fund. He had watched the town grieve for a girl he had buried. The realization was sickening. The town's old buried fear was replaced by a new, active horror. Detective Maria Karras assembled her team. She was sharp, empathetic, and relentless. She had access to technology Frank Miller could only have dreamed of. She partnered with a young, tech-savvy detective named Ben Carter, who specialized in digital forensics, and she requested assistance from the Michigan State Police's Cold Case Unit, bringing in a seasoned forensic psychologist. Their first meeting was in a brightly lit conference room, Sarah's high school photo projected on a large screen. "We are not here to fix the 1988 investigation," Karras told her team, her voice ringing with authority. We are here to solve a 2023 homicide. Our victim is Sarah Jenkins. Our crime scene is the former backyard of Arthur Harrison. Our primary and only suspect is Harrison himself. Emily Jenkins was brought in, not as a victim's family member, but as a consultant. She sat at the table, her presence lending a heavy moral weight to the proceedings. She laid out Harrison's 1979 resignation, the proof of his fixation on students. "He lied," Emily said, her voice steady. "He lied to Detective Miller. He said he saw her walk by at 10:05, but she never walked by. She was already dead." The team began to build their case. Carter tracked Harrison's digital footprint. He was 78 years old, living in a retirement community in Naples, Florida. He lived a quiet life. The forensic team, meanwhile, was meticulously analyzing the denim jacket and the tarp Sarah had been wrapped in. Even after 35 years in the mud, there might be trace evidence. Karras and the psychologist began to build a profile of Harrison. A narcissist, a predator who hid in plain sight, using his position of trust as a cover. His statement in 1988 was now seen for what it was, a brilliant, arrogant piece of misdirection. By claiming to be the last person to see her alive, he controlled the narrative, sending the police on a wild goose chase 4 blocks away, while he, presumably, was burying her body under the cover of darkness. The team worked with a new, burning urgency. They were not just working for Sarah, they were working for Emily, and for the entire town that had been deceived for so long. The team followed the new threads with methodical precision. Detective Karras and Detective Carter flew to Naples, Florida. They didn't go to arrest Harrison immediately. They went to surveil him. They needed something more, something to tie him definitively to the crime, not just the location. While they watched the 78-year-old man shuffle to his mailbox, the forensics team back in Michigan got a break. The tarp Sarah was wrapped in was an industrial-grade blue polytarp. Fibers from the tarp were found embedded in the denim of her jacket. More importantly, attached to the fibers of the tarp, they found a single microscopic fiber that did not belong. A woolen fiber, dyed a specific maroon color. Karras had Carter run a search on Harrison's old house in Cedar Creek. They pulled the original property records. In 1987, the year before Sarah vanished, Harrison had filed a permit to build a new tool shed in his backyard. The location of the shed, long since torn down, was exactly where the annex foundation was being dug. He had buried her, then built a shed directly on top of the grave, sealing it. Karras then had the forensic psychologist review the complaint from 1979. The language was specific. Harrison had been giving the 16-year-old girl unwanted gifts. Back in Naples, Karras and Carter made their move. They obtained a warrant for abandoned DNA, collecting a coffee cup Harrison threw away at a local cafe. The DNA from the cup was expedited back to the Michigan lab to be run against any potential profiles found on the evidence. While they waited, Karras decided to re-interview the diner staff. Brenda, Sarah's co-worker, was now in her 50s. Karras showed her the photo of Harrison. "Mr. Harrison," Brenda said, confused. "Yeah, I remember him. He used to come into the diner sometimes. Always sat in Sarah's section." Karras felt a chill. "Did he come in that night, the night she disappeared?" Brenda paused, thinking hard, dredging up a memory 35 years old. I think he did. Yes, he came in late, around 9, just for coffee. He talked to Sarah for a bit. He left maybe 30 minutes before her shift ended." This was the missing link. He hadn't just seen her on the street. He had known she was working, known she was getting off, and known she would be walking home right past his house. The chance sighting was a lie. It was an ambush. The revelation changed everything. The forensic psychologist on the team pieced together the narrative, presenting it to Karras with grim certainty. Arthur Harrison was not an impulsive predator. He was a planner. He had a history of fixating on girls Sarah's age. He had been grooming her, in a sense, at the diner, hiding his obsession behind the mask of the friendly, supportive counselor. On August 12, 1988, he knew her schedule. He left the diner 30 minutes before her, drove the 2 blocks home, and waited. He likely intercepted her on the sidewalk, not in a violent abduction, but with a familiar, trustworthy offer. "Sarah, it's late. Let me give you a ride home." She knew him. She trusted him. She would have gotten in the car. Inside his house, the narrative turned dark. He would have made his advance. Sarah, strong-willed and independent, would have rejected him, probably forcefully, threatening to expose him. Harrison, the man who had already lost one career over a similar complaint, panicked. His public mask was threatened. In that moment of narcissistic rage, he struck her. The medical examiner's report, though limited by the state of the remains, had noted a comminuted fracture on the left temporal bone, a blow to the side of the head with a heavy, blunt object. It was a single, violent act of panic. He had killed her. The rest of his actions were cold, calculated preservation. He wrapped her body in the tarp he had in his garage, a tarp he likely had ready for his new shed construction. He dragged her to the back of his property, to the spot where the shed would go, and buried her in the soft earth. The next day, as the town was forming search parties, Arthur Harrison was likely building his tool shed, pouring concrete over his secret, and when Detective Miller came knocking, Harrison delivered his masterpiece of deception, redirecting the entire investigation with a simple, neighborly lie. The final piece of evidence came back from the lab, the maroon woolen fiber found on the tarp. It was a rare carpet fiber, popular for only a few years in the early 80s. Detectives searching Florida records found an old photograph from an estate sale ad when Harrison sold his Cedar Creek house. The living room carpet, visible in the photo, was the exact same deep maroon. Detective Karras, armed with the fiber evidence, the 1979 complaint, Brenda's testimony, and the undeniable fact of the body's location, flew back to Florida. This time, she was accompanied by local Naples police. On November 20th, 2023, Arthur Harrison, 78 years old, was arrested for the 1988 murder of Sarah Jenkins. He was frail, walking with a cane, but his eyes, when he saw Karras, were cold and aware. He showed no surprise, no remorse. He simply invoked his right to an attorney. The news of the arrest electrified Cedar Creek, but it was not a celebratory moment. It was a deep, collective trauma. The man who had counseled them through their grief, who had sat at high school graduations and football games, was a monster. People who had known him felt violated, their own memories tainted. How many other girls had he fixated on? The realization that the killer had not been a stranger, a transient, but one of their own, a man entrusted with their children's futures, was an almost unbearable truth. For Helen and Emily Jenkins, the arrest was a seismic event. The what-if that had defined their lives for 35 years was gone, replaced by the brutal what was. Emily sat with her mother, holding her hand, as the news reports played on the television. There was no relief, not yet. There was only the staggering, crushing weight of the truth. Sarah hadn't run away. She hadn't been pulled into a van. She had been betrayed and murdered by someone she knew, someone the entire town thought was good. 35 years. It had taken 35 years for the Earth, disturbed by a construction project, to finally give up its secret. The silence that Helen had lived in for decades was broken, filled with the ugly, painful noise of the truth. Given Arthur Harrison's advanced age and the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence, the body in his yard, the fibers, the 1979 complaint, the motive, his lawyers advised him to plead guilty. A trial would only solidify his image as a monster and guarantee a sentence he would never survive. On March 14, 2024, the Cedar Creek courthouse was packed. It was a cold, grey Michigan day. Media vans lined the street. Arthur Harrison, frail in a wheelchair and an orange jumpsuit, was wheeled before the judge. He pled guilty to second-degree murder. The climax of the day, however, was not the plea. It was the victim impact statements. Helen Jenkins was too frail to speak, so Detective Maria Carras read her statement aloud. A heartbreaking letter to the daughter who never came home. A description of a house kept frozen in time. Then Emily Jenkins stood. She was no longer the 12-year-old girl, the obsessed paralegal, or even the advocate. She was simply Sarah's sister. She did not look at Harrison. She spoke to the court. For 35 years, she said, her voice clear and strong, our family lived in a void. We were haunted not just by Sarah's absence, but by the unknown. You, Mr. Harrison, did not just kill my sister. You poisoned this town. You preyed on our trust. You watched us search. You watched us cry. And you said nothing. She spoke of the years stolen, of the milestones Sarah never reached, of the grandchildren Helen never had. Today, you are held accountable, she concluded. But there is no closure. There is no moving on from this. There is only the end of the question and the beginning of justice. The judge, visibly moved, sentenced Arthur Harrison to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was wheeled out of the courtroom, a cold rain began to fall. Helen Jenkins, sitting in the front row, tightly clutched the small silver heart-shaped locket, now cleaned and polished, that had finally brought her daughter home. The story of Sarah Jenkins added a new, tragic chapter to the history of Cedar Creek. The community center annex was eventually built, but on the site where Sarah was found, a memorial garden was planted. It's a quiet, beautiful space with a single granite bench dedicated to her memory and to the persistence of truth. Arthur Harrison died in a prison hospital 6 months after his sentencing. He took any other secrets he had to the grave. Emily Jenkins' work with the Michigan Hope Initiative continues. Her own case is closed, but her mission is more potent than ever. She has become a national voice for cold cases, a symbol of how one person's refusal to forget can even decades later uncover justice. Helen Jenkins passed away in the spring of 2025. She was buried next to Sarah, the sister she was finally reunited with in death. The Jenkins house on Elm Street was sold, the room frozen in 1988, finally released from its vigil. The case changed procedures in Michigan, emphasizing the need to reinvestigate reliable witness statements in cold cases. Emily often sits on the bench in the memorial garden, watching the sunset. The grief for her sister never faded, but it no longer feels like a question. It is instead a memory, heavy but whole. Sarah's story is a painful reminder that the most devastating monsters are often the ones we trust the most. But it is also a testament to the fact that the earth cannot keep secrets forever, and that a sister's love can be strong enough to outlast the decades and bring the truth, however painful, into the light. There are thousands of families still waiting for their own answers. If you have information about any unsolved case, no matter how small, please contact your local authorities. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing for more stories of justice, long delayed.